The summer of 1998 felt different in Cedar Falls, Minnesota. Maybe it was the relentless heat that had settled over the small lakeside town like a heavy blanket. Or perhaps it was the way the adults whispered when they thought the children weren't listening. 16-year-old Emma Hartwell couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in their quiet community, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. Lake Minowaska stretched before her like a mirror, its surface barely disturbed by the gentle morning breeze. Emma sat on the weathered dock behind her family's cabin, her bare feet dangling in the cool water while she waited for her younger sister. The wooden planks creaked softly beneath her, a sound she'd grown up with during their family's annual summer stays at the lake house their grandfather had built in the 1940s. Before we continue with Emma's story, I'd love for you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. It really helps us bring you more of these mysterious, true stories. And please let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. We love hearing from our viewers. Emma, wait for me! 14-year-old Lily's voice carried across the water as she jogged down the gravel path from their cabin, her long auburn hair streaming behind her. Where Emma was thoughtful and cautious, Lily was pure energy, always ready for the next adventure, always pushing boundaries just a little further than their parents would have preferred. The sisters had been inseparable that summer, perhaps sensing that their childhood together was drawing to a close. Emma would be a senior in the fall, already talking about college applications and her dreams of studying journalism in Minneapolis. Lily, meanwhile, was just coming into her own, her artistic talents beginning to flourish under their art teacher's encouragement back home in Cedar Falls. Their mother, Patricia Hartwell, emerged from the cabin carrying a wicker basket packed with sandwiches and lemonade. She was a pragmatic woman, a high school English teacher who had always encouraged her daughters to be independent and strong. But lately, Emma had noticed worry lines creeping around her mother's eyes, especially when she read the newspaper or watched the evening news. "Don't swim out too far today, girls," Patricia called out, though she'd been saying the same thing every summer for as long as Emma could remember. "The current's been stronger than usual this year, with all the rain we've had." Patricia wasn't wrong. The spring of 1998 had brought record rainfall to central Minnesota, and the lakes were higher than they'd been in decades. Old-timers in town spoke of seeing shoreline landmarks they hadn't observed in 20 years, now sitting several feet underwater. Emma's father, Robert, was already at work, despite it being Saturday. As the town's only full-time police officer, Cedar Falls was small enough that they shared their law enforcement with 2 neighboring townships. He'd been putting in extra hours lately. There had been a string of break-ins at summer cabins around the lake. Nothing major, but enough to keep him busy, filing reports and checking on properties. "Race you to the swimming platform," Lily challenged, pointing to the wooden float anchored about 50 yards from shore. It was their usual morning routine, a quick swim before the day grew too hot, followed by hours of reading, sketching, or exploring the wooded trails that wound around the lake. Emma grinned and dove in, her body cutting cleanly through the water. She was the stronger swimmer, but Lily was faster, and they reached the platform at almost the same moment, laughing and splashing as they hauled themselves up onto the sun-warmed wood. The lake was unusually quiet that morning. Usually, by this time, they'd see other families emerging from their cabins, children's voices carrying across the water, maybe the distant hum of a fishing boat's motor. But today, the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the platform and the cry of a loon somewhere across the lake. "It's weird how empty it is," Lily observed, wringing water from her hair. She was wearing her favorite one-piece swimsuit, bright yellow with tiny blue flowers, a detail that would later be burned into their parents' memories. Emma nodded, scanning the shoreline. "Maybe people are sleeping in. It is Saturday." But she felt it too. that strange quietness that seemed to press down on the lake like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. They spent the next hour diving off the platform, playing their childhood games of Marco Polo and seeing who could hold their breath the longest underwater. Lily was practicing the photography techniques she'd learned in her summer art class, using a waterproof disposable camera to take pictures of Emma diving, of the sun reflecting off the water, of the loons that had built a nest in the reedy shallows near the old Mackenzie property. Around 11 o'clock, they decided to swim back to shore for lunch. Patricia had promised to make her famous grilled cheese sandwiches, and both girls were getting hungry. They dove off the platform one last time, Emma going first as always, her protective instincts making her want to test the water before her younger sister followed. The water was colder than usual at that depth, and Emma felt something brush against her leg, probably just a fish or some lake weeds stirred up by the recent storms. She surfaced, looking back to see Lily preparing to dive. "The water's a bit murky down there," Emma called out. "Be careful of the weeds." Lily gave her a thumbs up and dove in, her form perfect as always. She'd been on the diving team at school and moved through the water with a grace that Emma had always envied. Emma began swimming toward shore using her strong, steady stroke. She was about halfway there when she realized she couldn't hear Lily swimming behind her. She treaded water and turned around, expecting to see her sister's head bobbing in the water, or maybe floating on her back. Lily loved to float and watch the clouds, but the water around the platform was empty. "Lily!" Emma called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly too quiet lake. "Lily!" She swam back toward the platform, her heart beginning to race. Maybe Lily was playing a trick, hiding under the platform or holding her breath longer than usual. It wouldn't be the first time her sister had pulled a prank. But when Emma reached the platform and dove underwater, searching frantically in the green-tinted depths, she found nothing. No Lily, no disturbance in the sandy bottom. Just the eerie silence of deep water and the cold current that seemed to tug at her legs like invisible hands. Emma's training from her lifeguarding course at the community center kicked in. She took a deep breath and dove deeper, her eyes burning from the lake water as she searched every inch around the platform. The visibility was poor due to the recent rains, and sediment hung in the water like a murky curtain. When she surfaced the fourth time, gasping and desperate, Emma began screaming for help. "Mom! Dad! Help! Lily's gone! Help!" Her voice echoed across the empty lake, bouncing off the water and disappearing into the thick stands of pine and birch that surrounded the shoreline. In the distance, she could see Patricia emerge from their cabin, hand shading her eyes as she tried to understand what was happening. Emma continued diving again and again until her lungs burned and her muscles ached. By the time Patricia reached the water's edge, Emma was sobbing and hyperventilating, clinging to the platform as she gasped out what had happened. "She was right behind me," Emma kept repeating, her teeth chattering from cold and shock. "She was right behind me, Mom. I heard her dive in." Patricia didn't hesitate. Despite being fully clothed, she plunged into the lake and began her own desperate search. Within minutes, neighbors who had heard Emma's screams began arriving. The Andersons from 2 cabins down, old Mr. Paulson, who lived year-round in his converted fishing shack, the young couple from Chicago who were renting the Morrison place for the week. Someone called 911 from the Andersons' cabin phone. Someone else drove into town to find Robert Hartwell. Within an hour, Lake Minowaska was swarming with volunteer firefighters, EMTs, and eventually the county sheriff's dive team from Wilmar. The search continued until darkness made it impossible to see into the water. Underwater, the dive team found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence that Lily Hartwell had ever been in that part of the lake. The bottom was sandy with patches of lake weeds, but there were no hidden crevices or underwater obstacles that could trap a swimmer. By the second day, the State Bureau of Investigation had taken over the case. Special Agent Sarah Chen arrived from Minneapolis with a team of investigators and advanced sonar equipment. They mapped every inch of the lake bottom, searched every inlet and outlet, questioned every resident and visitor. Emma repeated her story dozens of times, to her parents, to the local police, to Agent Chen, to a child psychologist brought in from the state capital. Her account never wavered. She and Lily had been swimming together. Lily dove off the platform after her, and when Emma looked back, her sister was gone. The investigation revealed no evidence of foul play. There were no suspicious vehicles reported in the area, no strangers seen around the lake. The Hartwells were a well-respected family with no enemies, no financial problems, no family conflicts that might suggest a reason for someone to harm Lily. As the days turned into weeks, the story began to consume the local and regional media. Teen girl vanishes in Lake Minnewaska mystery became a headline in newspapers across Minnesota and eventually caught the attention of national news programs. The family received hundreds of letters from people claiming to have psychic visions of Lily's whereabouts, tips from well-meaning strangers who thought they'd seen her in distant cities, and unfortunately, cruel hoaxes from people who seemed to enjoy their suffering. Emma found herself the center of unwanted attention. Some people whispered that she must know more than she was telling. Others suggested that the sisters had been fighting, that maybe Emma had done something to hurt Lily. The speculation was torture for a girl who was already drowning in guilt and survivor's remorse. Patricia took a leave of absence from her teaching job to coordinate the search efforts. She organized volunteer groups, maintained contact with law enforcement agencies across the Midwest, and never stopped believing that Lily would come home. Robert worked overtime to pay for private investigators and search teams, his police training telling him that the longer Lily remained missing, the less likely it was that they'd find her alive. As autumn arrived and the lake began to cool, the active search was officially called off. The case remained open, but Agent Chen was reassigned to other investigations. The media attention faded. Life in Cedar Falls slowly returned to what passed for normal, though the Hartwell family would never be the same. Emma returned to school for her senior year, but the girl who had been outgoing and confident was now withdrawn and haunted. Her grades suffered. Her college plans were put on hold. She couldn't bear to be around water, couldn't even take a shower without panic attacks. The swimming scholarship she'd been working toward evaporated along with her ability to set foot in a pool. The family stopped coming to the lake house. Patricia couldn't stand to look at the water where she'd lost her daughter, and Emma's trauma was too severe for her to even make the drive up from Cedar Falls. Robert tried to sell the property, but no one wanted to buy the cabin where the Hartwell girl had disappeared. Eventually, they just boarded it up and tried to forget it existed. Years passed. Emma eventually went to college, studying social work instead of journalism. She became an advocate for families of missing children, channeling her pain into helping others navigate the nightmare of having a loved one vanish without a trace. She never married, never had children of her own. The fear of loss was too deeply embedded in her psyche. Patricia returned to teaching, but never quite recovered her former enthusiasm for life. She joined support groups for parents of missing children and became active in organizations that lobbied for better funding of search and rescue operations. Robert took early retirement and spent his days fishing on lakes far from Minowaska, always watching the water with the trained eye of someone who had seen what it could take away. But Emma never stopped wondering what had really happened to her sister that day. In quiet moments, she would find herself analyzing every detail of those final minutes, searching for clues she might have missed, explanations that might make sense of the impossible. She kept Lily's art supplies in her closet, her sister's favorite books on her shelf, the bright yellow swimsuit wrapped in tissue paper in a drawer she rarely opened, but never could bear to empty. 25 years is a long time to carry unanswered questions. It's long enough for a traumatized teenager to become a middle-aged woman, for parents to age into their 70s, for a small town to nearly forget a tragedy that once consumed it. But some mysteries have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them, bringing with them the possibility of answers that have been waiting in the dark for decades. In the summer of 2023, Lake Minnewaska was lower than it had been in over 30 years. A severe drought had gripped Minnesota for 3 consecutive seasons, and the lake level had dropped nearly 8 feet from its normal summer height. Docks that were usually floating sat on dry ground. Boat ramps ended 20 yards from the water's edge. Swimming areas that had been deep enough for diving were now shallow enough to wade across. For long-time residents like Harold Paulson, now 87 and one of the few people who still lived year-round at the lake, the low water levels revealed a landscape he hadn't seen since his childhood. Stumps of trees cut down when the lake was first dammed in the 1920s poked above the surface like ancient tombstones. The foundation of an old fishing lodge, abandoned and flooded in the 1950s, emerged from the water like the skeleton of some prehistoric creature. Harold had lived through 3 major droughts at Minowaska, but nothing quite like this. He spent his mornings walking along the newly exposed shoreline, collecting bits of history that the receding water left behind. Old bottles, fishing lures, parts of boats that had sunk and been forgotten. It was like archaeology, he told his visiting nephew, piecing together the hidden history of the lake. It was on a Tuesday morning in late July when Harold made a discovery that would change everything for the Hartwell family. He was walking along what had once been the deep water near the old swimming platform. The same platform where Lily Hartwell had been seen for the last time 25 years earlier. The platform itself had been removed by the county years ago, but Harold remembered exactly where it had been anchored. Partially buried in the sandy bottom, now exposed to sunlight for the first time in decades, Harold spotted something that didn't belong with the usual debris of lake life. It was a rectangular shape, about the size of a shoebox, covered in what appeared to be layers of lake sediment and algae growth. Harold's first instinct was to keep walking. At his age, he'd learned that most mysterious objects found in lakes turned out to be disappointingly mundane. Old bait containers, pieces of docks, trash that had sunk and been forgotten. But something about the shape and size of this object nagged at him. He'd been thinking about the Hartwell girl a lot lately, especially with the 25th anniversary of her disappearance approaching. The local newspaper had run a retrospective article, and Emma Hartwell, now Emma Hartwell Morrison, though she'd kept her maiden name professionally, had given her first interview in years about her sister's case. Using a stick to scrape away some of the accumulated sediment, Harold could see that the object was actually a metal box of some kind, with what looked like a tight-fitting lid. It was heavy enough that it took considerable effort for him to pull it free from the sandy bottom and drag it up to dry ground. Back at his cabin, Harold used a garden hose to rinse away 25 years of lake muck. What emerged was a waterproof metal camera case, the kind that serious photographers used to protect their equipment during outdoor shoots. The case was secured with heavy-duty latches and appeared to be in remarkably good condition despite its long submersion. Harold's hands shook as he opened the latches. Inside, protected by the watertight seal and what appeared to be additional plastic wrapping, were dozens of photographs and several rolls of undeveloped film. Many of the photos showed scenes around Lake Minowaska, the old fishing pier, various cabins, people swimming and boating. But what made Harold's breath catch were the images of 2 young girls with auburn hair, clearly taken during the summer of 1998. The photos were remarkably well preserved, their colors still vivid after a quarter-century underwater. Harold recognized the girls immediately from the newspaper photos he'd seen over the years, Emma and Lily Hartwell. But these weren't the typical vacation snapshots a family might take. These photos had an oddly voyeuristic quality, taken from a distance with what appeared to be a telephoto lens. There were pictures of the girls swimming, diving off the platform, lying on the dock reading books. There were images of them with their parents eating lunch on their cabin's deck, playing card games in the evening. Some photos appeared to have been taken from the woods behind their cabin, others from a boat positioned across the lake. At the very bottom of the case, Harold found something that made his blood run cold, a series of photos taken on what was clearly the morning Lily disappeared. The images showed both girls on the swimming platform, then Emma swimming toward shore, then Lily preparing to dive. The final photo in the sequence showed Lily in mid-dive, her body arced gracefully toward the water, captured in what appeared to be the last moment of her life. But it wasn't the photos of the girls that ultimately convinced Harold to call the police. It was what else he found in the case. A small notebook filled with handwritten observations about the Hartwell family's routines, their daily schedules, and detailed notes about when they typically went swimming, when the parents left the cabin, when the girls were alone. The notebook also contained what appeared to be a planned timeline, with notations like E returns to shore 11:15 a.m. and L follows 2 to 3 minutes later, and most chillingly, retrieve L from North Inlet after E. Calls for help. Harold didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photos and the notebook, understanding that he was looking at evidence that could finally answer the question that had haunted the Hartwell family for 25 years. But he also knew that opening this particular door would bring pain as well as closure, truth as well as horror. The next morning, Harold called the sheriff's office in Wilmar. The deputy who answered the phone was skeptical until Harold mentioned the Hartwell case and described what he'd found. Within 2 hours, the same lake that had been empty for weeks was once again swarming with law enforcement vehicles. Agent Sarah Chen, now nearing retirement but still with the State Bureau of Investigation, drove up from Minneapolis that afternoon. She was grayer, wearing reading glasses now, but she remembered the Hartwell case as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. It had been one of the few cases in her career that she'd never been able to close, and it had bothered her for 25 years. "Mr. Paulson," she said, as she examined the contents of the metal case, "I need you to show me exactly where you found this." They walked to the spot where the swimming platform had once been anchored, now a sandy depression in the exposed lake bottom. Chen studied the area carefully, taking measurements, making notes, trying to understand how a case like this could have remained hidden for so long. "The water here would have been 12 to 15 feet deep in 1998, she murmured, more to herself than to Harold. "Someone would have had to dive down to place this here, or—" She paused, studying the photos again. "Or it was thrown from a boat and sank to the bottom." "Door." The photos were sent to the FBI lab in Quantico for analysis, but even before the official results came back, Chen was fairly certain what they would show. The film grain, the paper stock, the chemical processing all appeared consistent with 1998-era photography. More importantly, several of the images showed details, specific clothing, weather conditions, other people in the background, that matched witness statements from the original investigation. But it was the notebook that provided the real breakthrough. The handwriting was compared to samples from every person who had been interviewed during the original investigation, as well as to databases of known offenders. After 3 weeks of analysis, they found a match. The handwriting belonged to David Mackenzie, who had owned a cabin on the north shore of Lake Minowaska in 1998. Mackenzie had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, but had been eliminated as a suspect when he provided an alibi for the morning of Lily's disappearance. He claimed to have been in Wilmar that day, visiting his elderly mother at the nursing home where she lived. But Mackenzie had died in 2015, and his alibi had died with him. When investigators contacted the nursing home, they discovered that their visitor logs from 1998 had been destroyed years earlier due to privacy regulations and storage limitations. There was no way to verify whether Mackenzie had actually been there on the day Lily disappeared. What they could verify was deeply disturbing. A search of Mackenzie's background revealed a pattern of behavior that the 1998 investigation had missed. He had been arrested twice in the 1980s for taking photographs of children at public beaches, though the charges had been dropped when the photos were determined to be technically legal. He had been fired from a job as a school maintenance worker in 1992 following complaints from parents about his inappropriate interest in female students, though no formal charges were ever filed. More significantly, investigators discovered that Mackenzie had kept detailed journals about his photography projects around Lake Minnewaska. These journals, found in a storage unit he had rented under an assumed name, contained years of observations about families who stayed at the lake, with particular focus on young girls and their daily routines. The entry for July 18, 1998, the day Lily disappeared, was brief but chilling. Perfect opportunity. E swims to shore first as always. L dives deep, retrieval successful, package secured in usual location. Package secured in usual location appeared to refer to a root cellar behind Mackenzie's cabin, a stone-lined underground storage space that had been built by the property's original owner in the 1940s. When investigators excavated the cellar in August 2023, they found human remains that were quickly identified through dental records as belonging to Lily Hartwell. The forensic examination revealed that Lily had died from drowning, but not in the lake itself. Traces of fresh water in her lungs contained mineral compositions consistent with well water, not lake water. The evidence suggested that she had been held in the root cellar, which Mackenzie had apparently modified with a crude water containment system, and had drowned there either accidentally or intentionally. The discovery answered the question of what had happened to Lily, but it raised new questions about the timeline of events. If Mackenzie had somehow retrieved Lily from the lake without Emma seeing, how had he managed it? And why had he kept photographs of his crime for 25 years? Additional evidence found in Mackenzie's storage unit provided some answers. Along with the journals, investigators found underwater camera equipment, including an underwater scooter and diving gear. Mackenzie had apparently been an accomplished diver, despite never having mentioned this skill during his original interview. The timeline that emerged from the evidence suggested that Mackenzie had been watching the Hartwell sisters from an underwater position near the swimming platform. When Lily dove into the water, he had grabbed her and taken her to an underwater breathing apparatus he had previously positioned nearby. From there, he had transported her to a small boat hidden in the reedy inlet on the north shore of the lake. The entire operation had taken less than 5 minutes, explaining why Emma had found no trace of her sister despite her immediate and thorough search. By the time Emma was screaming for help, Lily was already in Mackenzie's boat, being taken to the root cellar where she would spend the final hours of her life. The waterproof camera case had apparently been Mackenzie's way of preserving evidence of what he considered his greatest achievement. The notes in his journal suggested that he had planned to eventually retrieve the case and enjoy reliving the experience through the photographs. But as the investigation intensified and continued for months after Lily's disappearance, he had apparently decided it was too risky to return to the lake. When Agent Chen called Emma Hartwell Morrison to inform her that her sister's remains had been found, Emma's first reaction was not relief or closure, but a profound sense of validation. For 25 years, she had lived with the unspoken suspicion of some people that she had somehow been responsible for her sister's disappearance, that her story didn't make sense, that she must know more than she was telling. "I knew something terrible had happened to her," Emma told Chen during their phone conversation. "I knew she didn't just drown accidentally. Lily was too good a swimmer, and the water wasn't that rough. But not knowing what actually happened was torture. At least now I know she didn't suffer alone, wondering why I didn't save her. The discovery also brought a measure of peace to Patricia and Robert Hartwell, now in their 70s and dealing with their own health issues. Patricia had developed early-stage dementia, but she had moments of clarity when she understood what the discovery meant for their family. "I always knew she wasn't in the lake," Patricia told her daughter during one of their conversations about the case. "I could feel it. A mother knows when her child is in the water. I knew someone had taken her, but not knowing who or why. It was like living with a wound that never healed." The Hartwell family held a private funeral service for Lily in September 2023, 25 years after her disappearance. She was buried in Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery, next to the plot where her grandfather was interred. The service was small, attended only by family members and a few close friends who had supported them through the years of uncertainty. Emma read a poem that Lily had written in her art class the summer before she disappeared, about the way light looked different when viewed from underwater. It seemed fitting for a girl whose final moments had been spent in the green depths of Lake Minowaska and who had waited 25 years for the truth to finally surface. The case officially closed in November 2023, with David Mackenzie being posthumously charged with kidnapping and murder. While justice in the traditional sense was impossible, Mackenzie had died 8 years earlier, never having faced consequences for his crime. The resolution brought the Hartwell family a form of closure they had never expected to receive. Emma returned to Lake Minnewaska for the first time since 1998, on the anniversary of Lily's disappearance in July 2024. She stood on the shore where their family's cabin had once stood, looking out at the water that had held their secret for so long. The lake was still lower than normal due to the ongoing drought, but it was slowly returning to its typical summer levels. Harold Paulson, who had become something of a hero to the family for his discovery of the evidence, joined Emma at the shoreline. At 88, he moved slowly, but his mind remained sharp, and he had developed a protective fondness for the woman who had lost so much to the lake he had called home for 6 decades. "She would have been 39 this year," Emma said, speaking more to the water than to Harold. "She wanted to be an art teacher, maybe open her own gallery someday. She had so many dreams." Harold nodded, understanding that some losses can never be fully measured or mourned. "I'm sorry I didn't find that case sooner," he said. "Maybe if the drought had come earlier." Emma shook her head. "You found it when we were ready to handle the truth. Maybe it needed to stay hidden until we were strong enough to face what really happened." She scattered lily petals on the water, not the lake lilies that grew wild around Minnewaska, but store-bought Easter lilies, Lily's favorite flower. They floated on the surface for a moment before the gentle current began carrying them away, small white offerings to the sister who had been taken too soon and mourned too long. As Emma drove away from Lake Minnewaska that day, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 25 years, the absence of the constant, gnawing need to know what had happened to Lily. The truth had been horrible, but it had also been liberating in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time since she was 16 years old, she could think about her sister without the crushing weight of unanswered questions. The case had taught her something important about the nature of closure. It wasn't about forgetting or moving on from grief, emotions that people had urged her to embrace for decades. Instead, it was about transforming unanswered questions into answered ones, changing the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing into the bearable pain of knowing too much. Emma continued her work with families of missing persons, but now she could offer them something she'd never been able to provide before, the perspective of someone who had waited 25 years for answers and lived to tell about it. Not all cases would be resolved the way Lily's had been, but Emma could now speak with authority about the possibility of unexpected discoveries, about the way truth sometimes surfaces in the most unlikely circumstances. Lake Minowaska returned to its normal summer levels the following year, covering once again the sandy bottom where Harold Paulson had made his crucial discovery. The swimming platform was never rebuilt, and the area where it once stood became an informal memorial site where people occasionally left flowers or small remembrances. The lake continued to host families on summer vacations, children learning to swim, teenagers falling in love for the first time, all the ordinary magic of summer that had been temporarily overshadowed by tragedy. But for those who knew the story, Lake Minnewaska would always be remembered as the place where a mystery that had haunted a family for 25 years was finally solved by drought, persistence, and the simple act of an old man taking his daily walk along the shore. Sometimes the truth waits a quarter-century to surface, but when it does, it brings with it the possibility of healing that seemed impossible for so long. The Hartwell case became a textbook example for law enforcement agencies about the importance of never closing cold cases entirely, about the way physical evidence can remain hidden for decades before being discovered. It also demonstrated how advances in forensic technology could help solve cases that seemed impossible to crack using the investigative tools available at the time of the original crime. But perhaps most importantly, it showed that families of missing persons should never give up hope. Not necessarily hope that their loved ones will return alive, but hope that someday they will know what happened, that the terrible uncertainty that defines their lives might someday be replaced by the clearer, though no less painful reality of truth. For Emma Hartwell Morrison, now 41 years old and finally able to sleep through the night without dreams of dark water and unanswered questions, the case represented the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. She had spent half her life defined by what she didn't know about her sister's fate. Now she could spend the rest of her life defined by what she did know, that Lily had been loved, that she had been mourned, that her disappearance had never been forgotten, and that even 25 years later, the truth had finally found its way to the surface.